Hello and welcome to Face to Face. Our program today is a little bit different than usual. It's a discussion between filmmaker Steve Poole and today's guest, Erik Anderson, who is a retired professional economist. As you listen to Erik talk about the financial things that are going on, please keep in mind the way the world's finances are being run today. If you think this is amazing and unbelievable, what they're going to be talking about, then keep in mind what's happened with the banks, with Enron, with the subprime mortgage disaster, because this seems to be possibly the same thing. Listening to it and understanding it in one watch is difficult, so if you're interested, please just Google Face to Face with Erik Anderson, Face to Face with Erik, that's E-R-I-K Anderson, and you can watch it again.
Well, we probably should start off by saying that I'm here on my own behalf as a member of the public. So that puts me as a shareholder, as a taxpayer, and as a ratepayer. So that's what I'm here for, to talk about things from that perspective, those perspectives.
So your interest, obviously, of course, is not from a governmental perspective or a corporate perspective.
No, I'm interested as a taxpayer. Are we getting value for our money?
And are we getting value for our money?
No, we're not. No. And I think that the material that is there in the public, for the public to see, anybody can see it, like I did. You'll come to much the same conclusion.
So why did you bother to take the trouble of looking over the BC Hydro financial records?
I was alarmed by the decision to embrace the independent power producer program that was basically started around 2002, 2003. And if you wanted to have a sort of a visual reference to go to, it would be available on IPP Watch, which is a website put together by Craig Williams in North Vancouver. And he keeps track of the various water licenses and water applications that are made collectively and individually. And it's a good site to go to. My reason for concern was really the contract that was available for all of us to look at in regard to the proposed gas generation plant that was for Duke Point about 10 or 12 years ago. We took opposition to that because it was an extraordinarily generous contract for the private producer. The order of magnitude was enormous. The cost to put that facility in was $300 million by the words of the producer, and the present value of the guaranteed contract, financial contract, was going to be $500 million, the present value. That was a very attractive deal for him, for them. They bore no risks whatsoever. They took no risks as to the input costs of natural gas. They took no risks as to any kind of charges that would come out of environmental issues, such as green taxes that would go with production of CO2 gas, for example. So I was alarmed when I saw this happening, and then I got alarmed when I started to see the price of electricity move up in the province to me as a user. And so I started looking at the financials for BC Hydro to see if I could find what pattern was discernible. It's I like to refer to it as a financial vector, and a financial vector I use as a means of identifying both direction and dimension. So there's two elements to this concept of vector. In the case of the records for BC Hydro, in 2006, the amount of assets that it took to do the job was just over around $12.5 billion. By 2010, it took $18 billion. So that was like $5.5 billion more. Now, you could say, well, maybe that's what was needed. But if you, and debt, of course, was parallel to this. So we're not talking about money being subscribed to by the province on behalf of all of us as shareholders. So debt followed that pattern. In the case of the actual energy that was consumed by you and I collectively, domestic customers as they call it, the amount of energy measured in gigawatt hours annually was around 52,000 in 2006, peaked out at 53.3 in 2008, and now has fallen back to 5,200. So the pattern of demand, you might say, reflected by those numbers it's relatively static or stable to decreasing. Decreasing would be understandable because our economy has been in a slow period, and it looks like to continue so. So the industrial demand isn't so great. There's things like power smart programs. There are other things where people are restricting their consumption of electricity, trying to save money. They're responding to higher rates, so they would naturally strive to cut back. And anybody who's a customer knows they're all trying to save money in various ways, and hydro is not just another one. Now, in terms of what it costs in assets per unit of energy, that translates into a total unit number of about $236,000 per unit, which is a gigawatt hour annual. If you move out to 2010, from 2007, it's up around 330,000. If you then take away the 8,000 hours that were provided under contract from the independent producers, the number is over 400,000. In other words, what has happened in the last 5 or 6 years, the total asset amount to produce 1 unit of energy that we consume has been increased by about 2 times. It's doubled. Now, that isn't, by any measure, that's a terrible outcome. Most people think of making an investment for some kind of economy, some kind of productivity gain, but it isn't happening. It's the opposite. And it's so deliberate, and it's so enormous. I mean, in that short period of time, it's staggering. It's unexplainable to me. Now, if you go back to the point of being a ratepayer, the revenue that hydro received in 2006 for 1 unit of energy, the one I've spoken of, was $52,000. By 2010, that was $61,513. The difference, that $10,000 a unit, is all to do with not an improved productivity, but an increased cost of running the system. It's enormous, and we only are just into this. We're only beginning it. If you go back to when this all started, it was about 2003 with the provincial government's announcement of the energy plan, and it's continued through to the present time with huge amounts of provision for new energy coming on. If the domestic market can survive and function quite happily, especially if we start to think of conservation and demand management, at around 50,000 gigawatt hours a year of energy available, we don't need the amount that is now coming at us in the form of the IPP energy package, which is the consultants estimate to be in excess of 30,000. That's not quite a double, but almost a double. When you do that, you are creating a huge surplus. Now, you'll have people say, well, we need to have insurance. That argument I don't don't accept, because I think that we've demonstrated for decades now that we can manage ourselves quite nicely without even trying to do conservation in a serious way. But when you start to introduce the concept of insurance, then you get into other particular examples that are, I think, relevant to the conversation. One is, we don't carry a resource of personnel and equipment to fight all our forest fires every year throughout the whole year. It's just impossibly expensive to do so, and it's ridiculous to even try. So what we do is we rely, and quite successfully, on the resources that we share between other provinces and maybe the states. And we share back and forth, which is totally logical. If you step back into the power system, electricity, we are part of the Western North American grid. If we are short at some point in time because we've had a little bit of a slowdown in water, and our dams can't do as much as we'd hope they would at a particular time, we have the market to go out there to buy from. Sure, it's going to cost us a little bit more, but nothing close to what this IPP program is costing us.
And this system has been set up for decades. It's been running efficiently for decades. We've been buying and selling power without really any difficulty for decades.
Exactly.
Until 2002, when this energy plan was implemented.
Exactly, yeah.
What is the scale of the financial issues?
Well, as I said earlier, the assets have jumped from around $12.5 billion in 06 to over $18 billion by the end of this last fiscal year in March of 2010. That we get basically 50,000 gigawatt hours out of. The independent consultant's estimate in 2009 for the IPP asset base that they were contemplating is something like 26 or a little over 26 billion. If you use the ratio of the Duke Point contract to figure out what the present value is under the contract as opposed to under the capital cost, it would be about 43 billion. So the prospect is we're going to be faced with financing another $43 billion worth of contractual electricity.
For how long?
Well, they're usually a pretty long time, like 15 or 20, 25 years. These are not short-term contracts. And there's a misunderstanding in a lot of places that the people in British Columbia are not responsible for the debt that these independent power producers sign on to. And that, I think, should be corrected, because it's not true. The lender won't give dime one to anybody who doesn't have a guarantee in his hand that there is going to be repayment on time of interest and capital. They aren't going to give you one single dollar. And if that is the case, that means that all the contracts between hydro and these IPP producers have to recognize that. They can't just say, oh, we're going to buy your energy when you produce it, and that's it. Go away, have a nice day. No.
Could you explain the debt to equity a little bit more clearer for some of the viewers?
The debt to equity ratio is a quick and dirty way of trying to describe to an audience the risk of financial insolvency. And in the case of hydro, it has traditionally run with a debt to equity ratio of 70-30 out of 100%. In 2009, they lost that, and it went over to 81-19 was the ratio in 2009. This last year, they brought it down to 80-20. And the reason for the 80-20, just so that everybody understands, there is a law that requires that hydro cannot pay its dividend or any dividend to the province that that is when their equity ratio is worse than 80-20. So that happened in 2009, couldn't pay any dividend, and in 2010 they paid about $40 million. But there's another dimension to that discussion, but maybe we should touch upon that in a different context.
The program you're watching is Face to Face. It's a discussion between Steve Poole and retired professional economist Erik Anderson. They're talking about unusual accounting practices at BC Hydro that could lead to a situation where one of the most treasured government-owned corporations in this country is going to be bankrupted.
Rate-regulated accounting. In August of this year, the Auditor General made his report to the legislature, and it contained a number of observations and recommendations on financial reporting and summary statements for the province and their crown corporations. On page 9, under the title Rate-Regulated Accounting, he starts off by saying the purpose of rate regulation is to ensure that 1. Ratepayers receive safe, reliable, and non-discriminatory energy services at fair rates from the utilities, and 2. Shareholders of those utilities are afforded a reasonable opportunity to earn a fair return on their invested capital. Now, in Hydro's accounting, a person can look to the statement of assets, their balance sheet, their consolidated balance sheet, and find an entry called regulatory asset account. The regulatory asset account is where expenses of the year are transferred from being expenses to being an asset as a accounts receivable or a payable from the customers of Hydro at a future date. And that's how they conveniently turn it into an asset from being an expense. Now, once it's in this account, and pretty much in a sort of needs-must way, they then take the money from the account, in some cases, and pass it through to the income statement. So, for example, in 2010, the income before this adjustment of operations, after including provision for financing costs, was a loss of $249 million. By transferring an amount of around 700, not quite 700, from this asset account called regulatory asset into the income statement, they turned the report that everybody read into a profit of $400 and some odd million. Now, it's important to realize that what is happening here, they're taking expenses of the current year and they're programming them off into the future and saying those expenses are going to be recovered through our rate system that we work with through BC Utilities Commission. So as a ratepayer, a buyer of electricity, you're on the hook for that amount of money out into the future sometime when that gets approved. So if you go to your statement, you'll see what's called a rate rider. And there's a rate rider currently on that, which is their anticipation of collecting money that they haven't got yet the legal right to collect, but they expect to. And of course, being a monopoly, and it's pretty easy to imagine they're going to get it. Now, just so you understand the dimension of it, I mean, the practice is a little questionable, and I'll show you some stuff from the Auditor General that says that. But the dimension of it, since 2005, in April 1 of 2004, which was the beginning of fiscal 05, the account this asset account was zero. By the end of fiscal 2010, which was March of this year, the asset account stood at $2,478 million. In the course of that period of time, transferred out of this regulatory asset account was an amount of $1.632 billion. So that means those two numbers, 2.7 and 1.6 added together, which is close, not quite $4 billion, was the amount of money that Hydro's board decided was deferrable expenses, and they turned it into an asset, and it now sits as an asset to the company. Nearly $4 billion in a very short period of time. That's like getting a second mortgage on your electricity bill, a big one. So that's one of the vectors that really caused me distress, this practice. Now, here's what the Auditor General had to say about it. The net effect of rate regulation in 2009-10 has been to increase net earnings of self-supported Crown corporations, BC Hydro, and thus reduce the annual deficit recorded in the summary financial statements, the government's own statements in Victoria, by $705 million. He goes on to say the effects of rate regulation on BC Hydro, which makes up almost the entire total, namely $696 million, increase the company's net earnings in 2010. BC Hydro also holds unamortized net regulatory assets of $1.7 billion, and so on. Now, he brings up something which is quite important in this discussion, and that is a change in accounting practices. From over a decade ago, when various companies hit the wall, literally, like Enron and Nortel, at the center of their problems was accounting. They were all playing fast and loose with bad accounting. The profession of accountants must have examined themselves in a critical way and decided that reform had to happen. And this kind of process takes a long time to happen because it involves a lot of discussion with various parties. Any event, we now have a new standard coming into effect, which is an international standard, and it's the new gold standard for accounting practices. And it would affect BC Hydro in that they would not have any longer the ability to do the deferment of expenses in the same way that they have been. Now, I have no idea what they're going to do because their annual report, they say they recognize that this is on the horizon. This is like in March, and it's to take effect January 1 of 2011, so that's about 4 months from now. And they say, we're studying it, but we don't know what we're going to do. Now, here we're talking about $4 billion of hanky-panky, and they don't know what they're going to do at this late date. That is so out of line, I can't believe it. It's just like, it staggers the mind. Let's go on further. On page 26 of the Auditor General's report, and this goes back to the discussion about the IPPs that we were earlier talking about. He says under the heading, Disclosure of Contractual Obligations, various P3s and other agreements that the government has entered into, either directly or through their various organizations such as BC Hydro, disclosure of significant contractual obligations is required. He's not recommending that they do it. He says it is required. So that suggests to me that they aren't abiding by the rules by disclosing. With details such as description of obligations' nature, the extent and timing of related expenditures. Now, in context, just to give you a sense of the scale of this, he says these are not small amounts. The province is committed to purchasing more than $53 billion in goods and services as of March 31, 2010. And that isn't even including BC Hydro's obligations under the IPP program. So what we're seeing is absolutely reckless endangerment of the financial welfare of the province, and I'm concerned about BC Hydro in particular. So he says, in the end, recommendations, we recommend that the government include additional information about the nature and contractual obligations in summary of financial statements, which of course the BC Utilities Commission and BC Hydro are not permitted to do by law, which comes from the cabinet, comes from the government. So that's not available to anybody. I've asked.
So this deferred expense account, once it's turned into an asset, and then is it used to support requests for higher electricity rates?
Yes, it is. Yeah, the applications that go into the BC Utilities Commission for higher rates are driven by a demonstration from Hydro that they have higher costs of operating, and that they also have an expectation of return on investment that was recently increased as by direction from the provincial government. So the BC Utilities Commission is confronted with this ongoing application for higher and higher rates that they cannot deny. They don't have a reasonable chance of denying under the rules, under the legislation. I asked a particular well-versed individual, specifically, was this system designed to actually promote the borrowing and spending of more money? And he had to agree that, the system in its design actually does promote that. It gives incentive for them to do it. And to me, that was a shocking revelation and admission. It wasn't just me seeing it, it was somebody who's basically got a vested interest in the system agreeing that I was correct.
So it's being set up to fail then?
It's being set up to obligate people to greater and greater financial obligations. And if you take it to the point where the system breaks, it will fail.
But once we get to a point where people can't afford their electric bills,
then it breaks.
And then the privatization will just flourish.
Well, there we get into the matter of speculation. There are people who believe, and I happen to be one, that this is not being designed in this way so dramatically, outrageously. It's not being designed by accident. You don't bring in legislation, you don't stand by and watch this go on and not intervene if it isn't what you want to have happen. If you cannibalize your capital base by this hanky-panky with the expenses and the regulatory rate account, and you start playing fast and loose with your borrowing, you're going to get in a position where you're financially dead in the water. And that's maybe what is wanted, because then you can say, oh, we've got trouble here, we got to fix it, and the only way we can fix it is we'll go out and get bids to sell off these assets, and then we'll let them produce the electricity and we'll buy it from them.
And this is, of course, the international neoliberal model.
Well, it could be characterized that way, but the point is that I'm sure there are bidders out there who would love and lust to capture a market such as in British Columbia with assets such as we have, and try and get it at bargain-based prices.
You're watching Face to Face. The question we're talking about today is BC Hydro being deliberately destroyed?
Where's the NDP in all this?
That's a good question. A year ago, I presented my case to my local MLA, MLA, and he seemed to be interested in it, and we were to have a discussion, hopefully with the energy critic, John Horgan. But after several attempts to arrange that discussion, and I wanted it on the record, There was never any discussion. As far as I'm concerned, they have been saying things, but what they've been saying has actually been almost pathetically of no value in the political sense. They have given the people in British Columbia no sense or drama of the dimension of what's going on. Maybe they don't understand it, I don't know. But they should, because I've been giving them lots of information. And they seem to be content to just be spectators in this whole business. And I can't understand it, personally.
Well, given the track record of Campbell, particularly with the HST fiasco, it doesn't look as though the Liberals are going to get into power next time there's an election. And it would seem that the NDP might end up taking the helm again. So if what you're saying that the NDP are being ineffective in this, do you think they're just going to continue on this IPP legacy, or?
Well, I have no evidence to suggest they're not.
So even if there's a change of government, there's
I have no direct evidence to say that there is going to be a change in the policy. No.
Is what's happening, is it reversible? Is it fixable?
Well, yes. There are ways you can deal with it. They're unpleasant, and they could be expensive, and there could be a lot of blood on the floor, so to speak. One way is to go in and break contracts, and the only justification you could have in doing so would be if you could prove that there was some kind of corruption involved, so that then the contracts would be seen as null and void because of that. The other you'd be up against Chapter 11 issues in regard to NAFTA, because I think a lot of this interest comes from the United States or U.S. corporations, so we would be confronted with that issue. We also have to recognize that TILMA is around, and that could be a game changer to some extent. So there are lots and lots of problems to overcome, but I have to think that there's at least the opportunity you could look at the issue of fraud, and then you could justify coming out of contracts on the basis of that.
Otherwise, of course, the taxpayers are on the hook. Yeah. Where do you think this directive is being pushed from? Do you think it's coming from Washington? Do you think it's coming from Ottawa? Or do you think it's coming from Wall Street? I mean, would you care to speculate on where this impetus is?
I have no idea, but I have to think that it's got to be from sources that are principally lenders. Lenders pushing onto the taxpayer and the ratepayer huge amounts of debt that are unnecessary, in my view. I mean, the timing of this debt and spending binge that I'm talking about, and if you can see just by going to the public record, you can see it, is absolutely the worst. I mean, we're sucked into a period when interest rates are low, and here's a copy of the interest rate schedule from the Bank of Canada for a 10-year bond, and you can see it's been continuously decreasing for the last while. So, you know, there's an incentive there to borrow and spend just because rates are low, but they don't stay that way forever. So we've been sucked into this situation by I think lenders, and now we've put ourselves at risk. There's another dimension to the discussion that might be of interest, and that is the concept of buyers and sellers market. When you are in a market where you are a producer, the best market for you is to have what's called a seller's market. So BC Hydro has been able to get what it expected and needed from the buyers. You turn that around, and you then become, if you get in as a producer, you get into overproducing, you have this huge obligation standing on your shoulder to finance debt. You can't afford not to sell. It doesn't matter what price, you still have to sell, because you've got to pay the interest, you got to pay the debt. And that is where you get into a buyer's market. So the buyer is in control. Now, if you were trying, like happened in the 70s with coal, Japan wanted to buy coal. And British Columbia, among other places, obliged them by saying, we've got coal up in the Tumbler Ridge area and we're going to sell it to you. Wonderful, we'll give you contracts, long-term contracts, said the Japanese. But they went around the world and they convinced a whole bunch of other places to do the same as they did here in British Columbia. As soon as they managed to create an oversupply situation, they said, oh, so bad, too bad. Those contracts now don't have relevance. In the marketplace, those are set too high. We have to have a lower price. That was a deliberate act by the Japanese to bring their costs down, the cost of coal, and it worked. If you think about BC Hydro and electrical energy, we're going to go from 50,000 gigawatt hours to 80 plus gigawatt hours under this program. And we're only consuming for ourselves 50, maybe not even maybe less. Suddenly we're going to say, oh my gosh, we have to find buyers for this surplus, 30 or 40,000 hours. Where are we going to find? Well, California, oh, sure, we'll buy it from you at 8 cents. Did you say 6 cents? Oh, yes.
Now, my understanding is California have fairly rigid environmental laws with respect to how power is produced. And
Yes,
I know that BC doesn't actually meet the requirements.
No, they don't.
So are BC going to try to find themselves fitting into the Californian requirements, or is this California just going to maybe change the regulations?
Well, following from what I just was speaking about of the buyer-seller market concept, I think California is deliberately trying to get us into an overproduction situation so they can buy it cheaper. Whether the issue of green or not is irrelevant in my view. They just want cheaper power if they can get it.
Another question I have too is the Nechako River, the dam there at the Camano. What are they using that right now for to provide surplus power?
That's private ownership, I believe.
Private ownership,
and they sell in the open market. So
Alcan or Alcoa, I guess is selling that power.
I believe so. Yeah.
So it wouldn't be reserved if BC needed it.
You'd have to go through some pretty close examination of the contract to know, and I don't know.
I see. So we have this infrastructure already in place. It's been there for a number of years, and yet we're being forced into IPPs.
Well, in the case of Camano, I mean, that was agreed to, and the whole system of flooding and so on was allowed to facilitate the production of aluminum, and the corporations subsequently have reduced their production of aluminum, but they haven't backed away from their production of electricity. And we had the same thing happen in Newfoundland, and there the Government of Canada settled a NAFTA Chapter 11 claim for $130 million, which nobody that I know of thought that they should, but they did. So it seems as the reason and the rationale for one set of conditions 30 or 40 years ago doesn't come forward to today. Everybody says, oh, the world has changed, and we're going to change with it.
So do you think this is part of the plan of globalism then?
Oh yeah, it's constantly on a motion. Yeah, in motion, yeah.
Where do you think Site C figures in all this?
Site C is a recognized location. It's been there for decades as an opportunity, and it is in the league of a legacy dam kind of format. I think Site C has been promoted all that well on the false expectations that hydro had of demand. So every time they made a Site C proposal in the past, they always pitched it as being supported by a growth in demand, which never materialized. I think that's a deferrable issue for quite a while, because I think a lot more can be done with both conservation of our consumption and also in terms of tweaking the existing structures we have in place.
So do you believe yourself that Site C is unnecessary?
At this stage, it's unnecessary.
Unless, of course, they plan to use that to, for the tar sands, for example, or
Well, that's a
pipeline
different
and-
that's a different issue.
Sure.
If we're talking about the need for people in British Columbia,
irrelevant.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's gone down. I mean, consumption. So you feel then that this is deliberately being destroyed. It's by design. It's not incompetence and it's not accounting.
well, you can't make an assumption that the people who are in charge of the BC Hydro and at the BC Utilities Commission and in the cabinet and their deputy ministers are all incompetent idiots. I mean, you just can't. That's totally illogical. You look at the legislation, everything is being done by design. I mean, somebody had to craft the legislation and have something in mind when they did it. And what we're seeing is what they basically crafted. The legislation is delivering what it's supposed to, which is this horrible financial mess. So you stand back and say, well, there's no other explanation other than this is deliberate.
Okay, so now you've tried to get you've applied for some freedom of information requests and so forth, and have you tried to get any information from the government whatsoever or BC Hydro about what's going on?
No.
Okay.
The only application I made was I wanted to test BC Utilities Commission to see if they would provide me with an example of a contract so I could read it specifically. And they said the legislation prohibits them from sharing that with the public. So all the IPP contracts, for example, are secret.
Interesting. What can citizens do to stop this?
Get mad, I guess. I don't know. I mean, join the recall campaign for Liberal MLAs, I guess, is one way. I mean, if they're doing this deliberately, you don't want them there, so you got to get rid of them somehow.
Yeah, so, and as you said previously, we would have to prove fraud, and then the contracts would become null.
Well, if you went that next step.
Yeah,
I mean,
next step.
One way of, there's steps in this process. One way, the first step is to really remove those who see this as the future, and you don't agree with them. As a collective society, we don't agree with what you're doing. You got to remove the people who have currently the power and are exercising that power. Then you look at what they've created, and you say, heck, what can we do about it? And that's when you call in the Ghostbusters and the lawyers from out of the country that don't have any kind of political issues.
But we still have Chapter 11 issues as well and other problems.
Yeah, but that's the federal government, and if the province says this has been done wrongly, and the federal government is inconvenienced by that, like they were in the case of Newfoundland, well, too bad. I mean, the federal government is the one who signed the NAFTA, not BC.
Yes. Isn't this deferred expense account turned into an asset concept kind of fraud too, or?
Well, it's certainly not seen as a good practice. If you look at the new international accounting standards that are supposed to be the ones that we want to embrace as a gold standard, I mean, it's dishonesty in public accounting. It's basically what they're saying.
And you mentioned earlier that this was probably the worst time they could implement this because if we had the economic crash, we've got hundreds of millions of dollars of toxic derivatives floating around the planet and so forth and so on. You might want to take that a little bit further and...
Well, timing, okay. What I've noticed in both federal and provincial politics is that people seem to want to be always promoting the rosy outlook and not the reality. There's a great example. Back in 98 and 99, the lady in charge of all of the derivatives and commodities trading, who reported directly to President Clinton, I think it was, she was saying at the time that this derivative industry was out of control and it was a threat to the financial integrity of the United States. She was trashed by all the big guys, Summers, Carlson, then chairman of the Federal Reserve. She was universally trashed, and was so bad, in the end, she just resigned, went away. Brooksley Bourne, I think, was her name. So 6 months or so after she left, and after having said this in front of everybody, including the Congress, we had the collapse of long-term capital. And long-term capital was basically bankrupt because they couldn't meet their margin calls. They had assets that were valued less than their obligations, financial obligations. So the Federal Reserve brought in the home team, and they said to all of the players and big players in New York, you can't leave here until you put in a check for $50 million or whatever amount they decided. And they did. They collectively put a pot together because the concern was a financial meltdown globally out of that particular example. Well, I've talked to traders, and these are derivative traders from New York since then, and they all collectively look upon that episode as a speeding ticket. Took no lesson from it whatsoever. And now we have, according to the Bank of International Settlements, something like derivative contracts outstanding of about $600 trillion. Now, one of the things that derivative contracts have that is important to recognize, they can only be crafted when somebody thinks they see something is not in line. In other words, there's a concept, a central tendency here. When certain affairs are in balance, then there's not a chance to do a business with a derivative contract. So you've got now people who since then, like 12 years or so later, who've collectively decided that things are so way out of whack, they've got 600 trillion plus in contracts outstanding. If there isn't a piece of evidence on this planet, besides that should have been enough for anybody with any kind of a tie to the financial industry to know there is trouble out there and you don't go stepping out into new debt. The Greeks did it. Man, they did it. And a whole bunch of other people did it.
The Latvians,
Yeah, and the Icelanders. I mean,
yes, yeah.
Everybody got sucked in by the snake oil salesman. And so at the absolute worst time, we're doing this. We're borrowing and spending, and we're not even getting value. We're not getting productivity out of these expenditures. In fact, we're losing it.
And of course, things got worse when Bush got in and repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. And
well, those are little steps along the way that added more fuel to the fire.
Yeah, how does the toxic derivative market then play into, how does it relate to BC Hydro then?
Well, BC Hydro has an active account where they have just normal business management where they buy and sell futures, and so that's fine. I mean, that's normal business. But where this does come into play is that you will get contracts being sold in the derivatives market where we're talking about electrical energy futures. And I mean long-term futures, not tomorrow or the next day. And that's where a lot of this debt will end up being traded and wrapped into contractual purposes. So, I don't know how much of what BC Hydro has done has ended up in the derivatives package, but I suspect some of it, because that's exactly what derivative guys do. They look for opportunities, and we are giving them a good one here.
And everything is connected, too. I think an important question for the viewers would be, how much do you expect the rates to increase to a maximum, do you think?
Well, there is no maximum. It's wide open. I would say in the case where I showed you, we went from 52 to 62. in a matter of 5 years, I think we're on an acceleration curve. We're not plateauing. So I would say the cost is going to be triple, quadruple in a 5-year, 6-year period.
So in 2005, for example, if you were paying $100 a month for your hydro, by 2011, it's going to go to, do you have any?
Well, you could probably say 4 times that.
4 times that?
Yeah. Yeah. If you know, unless, of course, the government says, oh, we got to sell all this, and then who knows what, you know.
What about the issue of water and NAFTA? If the IPPs get into the...
Well, the earlier conversation we had about Alcan, it clearly indicates that there's a moving target when it comes to understanding what we're doing and when we're doing it. We thought we were enabling a producer of aluminum to carry on, and we granted privileges in terms of a water resource and electrical energy from that water resource. So now we've come on several decades since then, and we're doing something. They're doing something different than what we envisaged. So I would say, yeah, water is got to be a potential out there. Export is basically what we're talking about.
Now, could you maybe speculate on everything we've discussed?
Ooh. My starting point in a speculation is that I don't believe that this kind of financial development is by accident. If you accept that as a fair statement, then you have to say, well, why is it being done? And I think it's being done deliberately to financially cripple the one big asset we have in this province, which is BC Hydro. Well, I don't want to be unduly alarmist, but I also want to galvanize people into possibly at least thinking about it, and more importantly, maybe in their own small way doing something about it. And the only way I can see is they can get on and be politically active on the issue, because this isn't going to get solved until there's a political action.
Thank you, Steve and Erik, and thank you, folks, for watching Face to Face. Remember, if you'd like to see this program again, it's on the internet. Just Google Face to Face with Erik Anderson. That's E-R-I-K Anderson. And once again, thank you for watching.